Joel, do you know what the definition of history is?
I mean, there's probably a lot of definitions. What do you have in mind?
Well, I heard this phrase that it's like one darn thing after another.
Yeah, well, it can feel like that at sometimes. The important thing probably to remember is that it's going someplace. I'm Joel Millen.
And I'm Jamie Bennett.
And this is Bad Books of the Bible.
It's a podcast about a collection of books with a curious pedigree and an even stranger legacy.
Speaking of going places, let's go back for a minute so we can go forward. When we first started the show, we talked, as First Maccabees does, about Alexander the Great. That was our first episode. And the book actually begins with his conquering spree and all the generals who divvied up his kingdom after he died. The one that most people have, I would guess at least, that most people have a passing familiarity with is Ptolemy the First.
Oh, right.
And then, of course, his part of the cake, his part of the pie that he took. And the reason why, well, because he took Alexander's cut of Egypt, or rather he took the territory that Alexander had, seized for himself in Egypt. He built the city of Alexandria, and he was the great something granddaddy of Cleopatra.
Sure.
So even if you don't know Ptolemy, you know Cleopatra, and so you got some connection there.
Yeah.
Like if Alexander's generals were trading cards, everyone would have Ptolemy the First, right? This is just like a universal.
Okay.
Now, another one that's important to remember, one that people have less familiarity with, is Seleucus First.
Right.
Nicator. Doesn't mean that he likes to smoke. I think it means that he's like the victor. Seleucus had been given control over Babylonia. Unfortunately, another general pushed him out. So in 312, Ptolemy the First loaned him some soldiers, and then he took back Babylonia. And over the next few decades, he gobbled up as much territory as he could. He pushed east towards the Indus River, and then west into Syria and ultimately Turkey, all the way really up to Greece.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, you can't take it with you when you go.
Yeah.
Seleucus left a picture in 281 when he was assassinated. So let's just keep that in mind. All good things must come to an end. Even for world domineering conquerors, you don't get to keep it. That's a motif actually in this whole story. By the way, Ptolemy the First's son is who did the murder. You got to keep that stuff in the family.
As they often do.
But after his death, there was a string of Antiochuses and Seleucises, like the first, the second, the third. They all come in. It's like a parade of these guys. The emperor stretches really far. We're talking all the way from Sardis in the west to Bactria in the east. That's like more than 3,000 miles. I mean, we're talking about like, what, isn't that like with the width of the continental United States?
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah, I mean, this is massive.
Yeah.
And of course, governing that amount of territory was like really tough.
Sure.
The Seleucids did it by our standards, exerting minimal control outside of encouraging Hellenistic culture and then regulating trade. But even that was too much. And the Seleucids started losing ground within a couple generations of their founder's demise. You get these local populations, they start gaining independence.
Yeah.
Outsiders are edging in, pushing in, reducing their borders.
Sure.
One very important example is the Romans, who defeated the Seleucid forces in 190. And then they had to give up most of Turkey. I mean, that was well, see, it was nice having you. And then it was honestly downhill after that. So Antiochus the Fourth, our friend, who we met at the beginning of this book, really not our friend, kind of the opposite of our friend.
Yeah, you're not a friend of the king.
No, this is not a good guy. Okay, Antiochus, we know that he's strapped for cash. And one of the reasons is because his whole empire is in disarray and shrinking. So this is the backstory for why Antiochus is out of bread. This is why he's got to go running around looting temples. This is why he can't keep it together.
Yeah.
I like to think of it as Antiochus is the heir of a family business. It's a long-standing family business, but it's been in decline for a long time.
Yeah.
And so, why is he strapped for cash, running around looting temples? He's got no money. He's got no resources. Why? Because this is the situation that he's inherited.
Sure.
He is in the parade of Seleucids and Antiochuses, he's the fourth of the Antiochuses, and they're out. They're like they have burned through all the capital.
Yeah.
And so his policy of enforced Hellenism that we encountered in First Maccabees chapter 1, and which is kind of the undercurrent of this whole book, this policy where he's going through all his lands and making sure everybody's on the same page, everybody's following all the rules that he wants them to follow, everyone is obeying the gods that he wants them to obey, sacrificing like he wants them to sacrifice. This is like a desperate play by him to take something that's falling apart, that's dwindling, and pull it together, hold it together.
Yeah.
And of course, it doesn't work. Like almost any act of pure desperation, it only gets worse.
Yeah, that's right.
We'll talk about some of the ways in which it gets worse in this very episode about our friend Antiochus IV. However, just to, extend this into the future, just to see how bad it gets, the Romans come back for more in 64 BC. That's about a century after Antiochus IV's death.
Yeah.
And they end it. The Seleucids still have a little bit of land, but they're pretty much, they're over. So that's it. You've got Seleucus I. He gets things going in 312 BC. It's all over by 64 BC. That's the extent to which this empire lasted. And it's a good reminder that, as the Bible often tells us actually about empires, they don't last. They come and they go. And the only thing that really persists are people on the ground that reorganize in different ways. And we're in the midst of one of those reorganizations.
A couple episodes back, we talked about how the Jews ran the abomination of desolation out of the Holy Temple.
Get it out of here.
And they were very careful to restore order in the temple and restore right worship in the temple. Now, I'm not sure if we mentioned that the cleansing ceremony took place exactly 3 years after the temple was desecrated.
Wow.
And especially to know that they restored order and threw off the abomination, right? That's the key thing for all of the people. But Bruce Metzger says peace did not last long.
Yeah, the neighbors, they're getting angry. In fact, that's what the narrator of the story says. They became very angry. So imagine the Jews, they finally get everything resettled. It's like the reset button on everything, and it's like these guys, they don't like it.
Yeah.
The fact that the Gentiles become angry is actually kind of a callback to Antiochus IV, when he first shows up. He's angry, they're angry, everybody's angry. But it's a like a recapitulation of this idea that the neighbors, the outsider in this case, the people looking in on Judea, are not happy with what the people in Judea are doing, and so they cause them a lot of trouble. They begin persecuting. So Antiochus persecuted.
Yeah.
Now these regional neighbors are persecuting.
Yeah. And so at that point, Judas and all of his company, they went out to rescue the Jews. And so they start going out to the neighboring areas, and they developed a strategy in order to rescue the Jews from this persecution nearby. The narrator says he engaged in many battles with them, and they were crushed before him. He struck them down.
Yeah.
So he's fighting hard.
Yeah.
It says that the Gentiles in Gilead began to get together to fight against the Israelites. And they were starting to camp right on their borders.
Yeah. Wow.
A little too close for comfort.
Yep.
And verse 9 says that their intention was, quote, to destroy them. So the Jews are taking this very seriously. And the Jews there in Gilead, they sent a letter to Judas, and they wanted to let him know how bad things were and that they needed some help. Chapter 5, verse 14 and following says, while the letter was still being read, behold, other messengers with their garments rent came from Galilee and made a similar report. When Judas and the people heard these messages, a great assembly was called to determine what they should do for their brothers who are in distress or being attacked by their enemies. In other words, they're getting letters from their brethren asking for help. They have the organized army. It is time to go out, send out 2 campaigns to each side of the Jordan to rescue them from their enemies.
One thing that's great about this scene is that the leaders go to the people. The leaders talk to the people.
Yeah.
This is a community effort. And it's not merely the act of like a domineering lord going out and having his way. Earlier in the book in chapter 2 and then in chapter 4, the Maccabees, they are depicted as consulting with the people.
Yeah.
Talking with them, sharing information, seeing what they think. This matters because, what we see in somebody like Antiochus is the exact opposite. What we see in Antiochus is a ruler who just has his way. Whatever he wants, that's what they're going to do.
Right.
And instead you get, and that's obviously a picture of like pride. That's a picture of like autonomy and this kind of thing. Instead, with the Maccabees, you get a picture of humility. So even though, Judas is like, he's rough and ready, he's hardcore, he's going to take people down. He's not a man to be messed with.
Sure.
He's still humble. And they know they need the people with them in order to accomplish what they have to do. And it's desperate, the situation that they find themselves in is desperate. They're going to consult with the people. He's not merely going to rule by his own dictates.
Yeah.
So Judas, he goes with Jonathan and they go east to Gilead, and he sends Simon to Galilee.
Yeah.
And they're going to go basically rescue these people in need. Now, I just talked a minute ago about Judas being humble. This is about ready to get very raw. This is about ready to get very brutal. And, as a peacenik, I find some of these passages actually like unnervingly uncomfortable.
Sure.
But it's important to remember that the Jews face literally an existential threat. They are like on a knife's edge. And I don't know how people want to, think about the ethics or the morality or whatever about Old Testament violence. That's an open question for people to debate. I think, though, in the midst of this particular instance that we're getting ready to go through, these instances that we're getting ready to go through, the back of our minds needs to be the context that these are people whose every neighbor is after their death, whose every neighbor seeks only their extermination.
Right.
And this is a moment that, sitting in a study in Franklin, Tennessee, judging somebody across time is very easy to do, but not very useful.
I think it's helpful to look at one town in particular, at Ephron.
Yeah.
They had a large company of soldiers. They had families even, because remember, they're taking all these Jews back home.
Right. So they go liberate them and they're bringing them home. It's not safe for them to stay in Galilee and Gilead.
Exactly. So they're bringing them back to Jerusalem, back to Judah.
Yeah.
Now, there weren't great roads at this time. So sometimes, especially in like mountain pass areas, they had to go through a town because it was the only way to get that many people through a town. In the case of Ephron wouldn't even let them in. They wouldn't let them pass through. Now, they had promised to pass through peacefully, and Ephron said no. I guess they were afraid, right? I mean, there were a lot of armed people coming through.
Yeah. Never mind. They're also bringing with them, refugees, right? So,
yeah.
Ephron may have sized this up wrong, who knows, but like that's the picture. You have an army with like villages and villages and villages worth of refugees.
So when it was clear that the people of Ephron wouldn't let them through, they camped and they put the town to a challenge. Verse 51 says he destroyed every male, and he basically brought the town down, totally destroyed it, to the point that they were even walking over the bodies of the dead.
Like totally destroyed it.
It's pretty gruesome.
Do we want to put an R rating on this episode? Can we do that? I mean, this is a brutal moment, obviously, in the story. One thing that's important to note here is that they were able to seize what the text calls engines of war. We're talking armaments.
Yeah.
We're talking like catapults, battering rams, things like that. These are things that make it possible to attack a fortified city. If you can imagine, that's how cities survived against armies. They had big walls.
Yeah.
And these walls would enable them to keep a sieging army at bay for quite a long while. Hopefully, the sieging army ends up running out of, interest or food or something, and then they leave. Well, the only way to shorten that window is to bash the walls down. And so seizing engines of war means basically now the Jews have the capability of actually attacking these strongholds that are opposing them, including, by the way, one that we are very familiar with, the citadel that is opposite the temple that the Seleucids set up. So this is all like foreshadowing something to come here in our story.
The text goes on to say that Judas was encouraging people as they went along. I mean, this must have been quite the journey.
Not just encouraging people,
right?
Laggards.
He's going after the laggards. He's making sure everybody keeps moving.
Yep.
It describes him as going up to, let me just read the words here, to Mount Zion with joy and gladness. And it says that they offered burnt offerings when they returned in safety.
Yeah.
It would be natural for readers of the Old Testament to see hints of the promised return of Jerusalem in Jeremiah 31.
Yeah.
There's multiple places in scripture where God's people are seen as being liberated in returning to the land.
These two chapters are full of victories and losses. And it would be a mistake to kind of imagine Judas's efforts as kind of like up and to the right. If you were looking at a chart of success over time, that it was just up and to the right. No, there's a lot of ups and downs, and there's a chapter of up and down right here, or a moment of up and down.
Yeah.
Down, to be specific, right here. So, Judas leaves Joseph and Azariah in charge when he goes out on these missions to save these refugees. And Joseph and Azariah, they're like watching Simon get all this credit and Judas get all this credit and Jonathan get all this credit. Like, these guys are making a name for themselves. These guys are like heroes, right? And remember, this is a culture that really values that. That's why we have all these callbacks to David. That's why we have, all of these references to people making names for themselves and so on. This is like fame is important in this culture, particularly for people of high standing. So these guys are like laying around at home and they're getting nothing. They're getting no action. They're getting no credit, no plaudits coming their way. They're like,
right,
we'll go out and do it ourselves. We'll go out and get some credit, some street cred ourselves. So they go out and they fight that old snake that we encountered before, Gorgias, but they get their butts kicked. I mean, the text says they were routed and they were pursued to the borders of Judea. As many as 2,000 of the people of Israel fell that day during this battle. So Judas and Simon and Jonathan, they're making it happen. Joseph and Azariah get routed. They get destroyed.
The biggest takeaway here is that God is working through Judas and his brothers to accomplish his purposes in delivering the Israelites.
Yeah.
And these guys are taking it in their own hands and not following the direct call of God.
Yep.
Verse 63 says that Judas and his brothers were honored by the Israelites, as well as it says, among all the Gentiles, wherever their name was heard.
Yeah, just to be clear, I don't think this means that they were loved. I think this means that they were, feared by the Gentiles.
Right. They've just been at war with all these people.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of those things where it's like their reputation has gotten out that they are big and bad and tough. You don't mess with these guys.
You don't mess with them. And, that reputation, that's going to show up in just another minute when we get into chapter 6, because word gets around. It doesn't just hang around in Judea. It doesn't even hang around outside the immediate environs. It gets its way all the way to Persia.
After Judas and his brothers returned to the land, the text says that they also won a few more victories. They brought their campaigns to an end. And we get another moment where there's peace for a minute. It feels like things are moving in the right direction.
So while things are settling down in Judea briefly, word is getting out to the east, where Antiochus, we last left Antiochus. He went into his own treasury. He opens the doors. Oops, there's crickets. There's nothing in there. There's mothballs, whatever. He's got to leave and go raise funds. So the heir of the family business, he's running out of capital. He's off to pitch a bank on a new loan. But of course, what that for him means is that he's robbing temples, right?
Yep. Back at it.
He's off in Persia trying to rob temples. And he's specifically, he hears about a temple that was famed for its golden shields, its breastplates, its weapons that were left there by Alexander, of course, Alexander the Great. And he thinks, I'm entitled to that. I'm going to go seize all this wealth. But the people who hear that he's on his way, they prepare and they withstand him in battle. They fight back, and Antiochus is not able to plunder this temple.
Right.
Now, this is the mood that he is in. This is the state that he is in when the footman comes up with the news. Hey, did you hear what's happening in Judea?
Yeah.
The short answer is no, I haven't. I hope all is well. But no, it's a gong show in Judea. And basically he's heard that Lysias went to fight them, that he fled, that he failed, that the Jews had basically seized arms and supplies, and that they had basically equipped themselves to defend against all invaders, that beyond that, they tore down his, statue of Zeus, the altars, all of that, and basically had re-seized the temple. So this is the worst possible news. He's struck out. He can't get any more funds.
Yeah.
And it turns out that that little ratty people that he had hoped would easily be squashed have completely undermined him in Judea. Aside from feeling sorry for himself, what's he going to do, right?
Yeah.
It says, honestly, that that's all he did do.
Right.
In chapter 6, verse 8, it says, when the king heard this news, he was astounded and badly shaken. He took to his bed and became sick from disappointment, because it continues to say things had not turned out for him as he had planned. Wah, wah.
It's helpful to remember that Antiochus is the villain here.
Yep.
Even saints like Hippolytus and Jerome in their commentaries on Daniel, when he comes up, they talk about Antiochus as like an antichrist figure. It really doesn't get any worse than this guy. He put himself in the place of God. He's now taken out by God himself.
Yeah. I think what's great actually about his demise is it's not glorious in any way.
Right.
Alexander seizes all this land, right? And he divvies it up amongst his generals before he dies, and they fight amongst each other, and they're all big and grand and, prideful people.
Yeah.
And they all die in, glorious ways, right? Or at least some of them do.
Yeah.
But not Antiochus the Fourth. This sad sack literally just cries himself to death.
Right.
He calls in his people, he calls in his folks, and he's like, here's the deal. Sleep has departed from my eyes. I am downhearted with worry. To what distress have I become, he says to himself, and into what great flood am I now plunged? For I was kind, beloved in my power, which, people tell themselves all kinds of stories. He says, but now I remember what I did wrong in Jerusalem. I seized its vessels of silver and gold without good reason. Basically, he says, I know that these misfortunes have come upon me because of that.
Yeah.
Now, I think this is the narrator of First Maccabees projecting a little bit of a kind of reckoning in the mind of Antiochus.
Sure. Well, the Jews weren't the only ones that thought that this was divine retribution. Even the Greek historian Polybius said that there were a lot of people that had speculated that Antiochus was punished by the gods with madness and death for going after the temple of Artemis.
Yeah.
So it really wasn't just a Jewish thing. But even among the Jews, it was widespread enough that it wasn't just in scripture. Like Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, he picked this line of thinking up too.
Yeah.
And he put the death of Antiochus on the desolation of the temple of Jerusalem.
Before Antiochus kicks the bucket, he sets up Philip as his successor. Philip is one of his friends, and he wants him to rule over the whole thing. Basically, the idea here is that Philip will help bring Antiochus up to be king at some point. Antiochus's son, I should say, who, you know, with all the daring originality that his family possesses, is named Antiochus. However, there's a power struggle happening already nascently right here, because Lysias hears that the king has died, and then he immediately sets up Antiochus, his son, to reign. So basically, he basically was his mentor. Lysias was his mentor. He thought he should be the one in charge. So you got basically two kings. You got two rulers. You got two claimants to the throne of the Seleucid dynasty right here, the Seleucid empire. And of course, that's going to be problematic here very quickly.
Now, remember, they've got this citadel thing going on. Verse 18 says, meanwhile, the garrison in the citadel kept hemming Israel in around the sanctuary. They were trying in every way to harm them.
Yeah.
So things are getting serious right there in Jerusalem. And so Judas devotes everything to going against the citadel, against the Acra. There were no more campaigns at this point against the nearby towns. They had to go all in on this one point.
Yep. This thorn in their side.
Remember, this is quite literally an act of rebellion against the king at this point. Judas knew that if they were ever going to be liberated, that they had to take this stronghold out.
They had those engines of war we talked about before. Remember, we're talking catapults, we're talking siege towers, things like that they can bring to the citadel to attack it. And that's exactly what they do. Some people escape from the citadel and they go off to Antioch to talk to the king. And they say basically, the king we're talking about here is Antiochus's son. They go there to talk to him and say, how long are you going to let this go on? Because, we've served you, we've helped, we've betrayed our own countrymen for you. And now we're getting ready to perish. And so, it's not right. You need to go do something. You need to go do something to stop them. It says, unless you quickly prevent them, they will do even greater things, and then you will not be able to stop them. So the king, he is enraged when he hears this. He's fuming. He assembles his forces. Okay. And this is if we're in the movie and we're watching this, you're just imagining troops coming in from all over. It's got mercenary forces coming in. He's got from other kingdoms. He's got his own army.
Yeah.
He's got basically everybody he can get in there, including from the islands of the seas, it says. So we've got troops coming in from all quarters.
Yeah.
The number of his forces was 100,000 foot soldiers, 20,000 horsemen, and 32 elephants accustomed to war.
Wow.
So this is a massive force coming now to repel Judas and squash his rebellion. I love this part of the story. It says that they distributed the animals among the phalanxes. With each elephant, they stationed 1,000 men armed with coats of mail.
Yeah.
And it says about these elephants that they gave them the juice of grapes and mulberries to arouse them for battle. We are talking drunk elephants. Now, I used to edit news stories back in the day. And I remember when we would come across the story about an elephant, this normally would happen in, different places. An elephant would get a hold of some palm wine and would go nuts and would rampage in a village. And we always put animal curiosity stories in because that was a thing.
Sure.
But I had no idea that drunken elephants wasn't just an oddity, an animal curiosity story. It's a military strategy.
Yeah.
So these guys literally get these elephants drunk so that they are like ready to fight, which is crazy to imagine. How do you even control these things?
I thought it was funny. I read several scholars skeptical that they got these elephants drunk, saying, oh, there'd be too much of a liability for the handlers. But
right, yeah.
Third Maccabees actually mentions Ptolemy ordering the elephant keeper to drug elephants, and basically says, it's very clear in Third Maccabees, get them liquored up with wine.
And stand back because this is,
they're sloshed and dangerous.
Yeah, this is about ready to get crazy. Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, war. All right, so these armies are coming together, and one fascinating moment. I mean, this is like a Lord of the Rings kind of moment here. Eleazar sees one of these animals, and it's got, it's covered with armor and all this, and it's a bigger elephant. It has more armor than any of the other ones. He realizes this is like the king's elephant.
Yeah.
And so he breaks the line and runs towards this elephant. Imagine the bravery of this guy.
Sure.
He runs right to the animal, and he is fighting off men left and right to get to the animal. And he finally gets under the elephant, and he stabs the elephant from beneath.
Wow.
Whereupon it collapses on top of him and kills him. Now, you would think that this might rouse the army, but actually the fierce attack, the onslaught from the enemy was so strong that the Jews ran.
When we covered Tobit, we were able to offer a lot of spiritual application as we went through the story. It lends itself to that.
Mm-hmm.
This one's a little trickier with all of the wars and the death, and it's rooted specifically in history. So it's a little trickier for us to understand that. However, the church fathers would see spiritual applications everywhere in scripture.
Yeah.
And so I was delighted when I came across this part from St. Gregory the Great talking about Eleazar.
Yeah.
He said, Eleazar fatally wounded the elephant during the battle, but died himself, crushed by the weight of what he had killed. So, first of all, he establishes what we know. Who does this man, who was vanquished by his own victory, represent? If not those who, having overcome their vice, become proud and fall under those very things they have conquered. He who took pride in the mortal blow he struck was brought to ruin by his dead enemy. We must keep a careful watch so that we do not fail to see that all good things are of no worth unless they protect us from the evils that can advance on us unnoticed. All good deeds perish unless they are closely guarded with humility.
Wow.
We do not want to be the kind of people who, in resisting temptation and fighting against vice, end up falling and being conquered by the same thing we're trying to resist.
We're at a turning point in the story here, and that up and to the right picture that we got before, it's really gone the other direction now. The Jews are in retreat. They are hiding in Jerusalem, and the king is closing in for the kill. So his armies are encircling them. He has siege engines built, and it says here, I mean, these are serious siege engines.
Yeah.
To throw fire and stones, machines to shoot arrows and catapults. I mean, this is heavy duty.
Wow.
Now, the Jews are not without resources. They build their own engines, it says, to match theirs. So, they stole those armaments before. Now they're like configuring them to fight back against the enemy. You can imagine these two enemies like lobbing fiery, projectiles at each other. I mean, this is an intense moment. Unfortunately, the Jews do not have enough food.
Yeah.
And they're out. And so they have to disband. And it feels like all is lost.
Yeah.
But as so often happens, when the situation feels most dire, when it seems most dire, some out of left field salvation occurs. And that's exactly what happens here. Lysias, who's in charge of the king's forces again, during this battle, he hears that there is a move being made back in Babylon to seize control of the government, basically to like rob him of his position. So he gives orders to withdraw. I mean, imagine this. They are like on the verge of utter annihilation, like annihilating the Jews. They're on the verge of total victory.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, because they might win that battle, but then lose like their power, they have to stop and they have to retreat. The king says to his commanders, daily we grow weaker, our food supply is scant. Basically the affairs of the kingdom press urgently upon us. So let's come to terms with these people, it says, and make peace with them and with all their nation. And then imagine this, not just like come to terms with them, but knowing the backstory, all that they've already been through, they're like, fine. And they can keep this place. They say, let us agree to let them live by their laws as they did before, for it was on account of their laws that we abolished, that they became angry and did all these things.
Yeah.
So they're like, our bad, never mind.
Yeah.
So they resolve to just like drop it, basically, and then head back to Antioch to fight off Philip.
Sure.
And keep control of the city. So Lysias, he knows he's going to lose Antioch to his competitor, with his rival within the Seleucid Empire. And so he's got to like leave the Jews alone so he can go take care of business. He says he's going to do that. Yeah. His commanders agree. They all recognize that their meal ticket's about to end too if they don't fix this. Yeah. And so they're out of there. And they just leave the Jews as they found them. But of course, with about 3 years of destruction in the meantime.
You can appreciate how relieved the Jewish people would be at this point. You know, the foes have finally left.
Yeah.
You know, it's not perfect, but they vanquished the foes and they have heroes.
That sets the stage for the rest of the book, really, and the rise of the Hasmonean dynasty and many, many other things that are to unfold. But this sort of like big moment in the story of First Maccabees is now over. The Jews have more or less their independence.
And to keep up with all the developments as we continue in the unfolding story, drop in at badbooksofthebible.com and follow us on social media. Subscribe to the podcast. Tell everybody you know.
We seriously would appreciate a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and a review if you have the time. We've had some great reviews so far, and they're like encouraging to see. And I know that inspires listeners to help them not only find the show, but set their expectations about what they're going to get when they hear it. So that's pretty awesome.
Absolutely. And if you have follow-up questions, you can email us through our Ancient Faith page. I'm Jamie Bennett.
And I'm Joel Miller.
You've been listening to Bad Books of the Bible,
a production of Ancient Faith Radio. Come back next week when our old friend Nicanor makes a reappearance.